Good evening, viewers, and welcome to another session of Mazungumzo. This is your host, Dr. Gilbert Gicharu Githere, coming to your homes with the program Mazungumzo. Just as usual, today we are looking at a very important scholar, a philosopher from Germany, and this is Hegel, Wilhelm Hegel, or Friedrich Hegel. And he has written this book, Phenomenology of Spirit, or Phenomenology of the Mind. And I've been analyzing it, and I did 4 parts, Program 1, Program 2, Program 3, Program 4. Now I'm kind of condensing it to a single program so that you can enjoy it and we can see what we've been doing. So bear with me, this is a longer session. It might go into 2 parts. But you will enjoy it because Hegel deals with so many things in life. And as you see on the screen here, I have a system where you can see me, but at the same time you can see the text that I'm using, so it's easier to follow. You can read and then you can listen to what I'm saying. You can take notes. We are utilizing the digital world to the max. So there's a good understanding and comprehension through this kind of facilities. Now, Hegel dealt with so many things because Hegel looks at life in this piece of Phenomenology of Spirit. He actually looks at it from the historical perspective of man, historical development of man. From, when we were gatherers, we used tools like stones, carvings. We use stones, tools to help us do the farming and hunting. He looks at life like that. But at the same time, it's good to understand Hegel because he also does a very interesting thing in that he looks at man from birth. You're born as a child, then you learn things from your parents, from your relatives, from the society around you, and how you acquire knowledge. So if you read Hegel, he has these things, category of things happening, and he's looking at all of them at the same time. So at times you think he's talking about historical development, but actually he's talking about the development of a child, or the development of the environment, or the development of the institutions. So actually it's a whole piece so involved that sometimes you can get lost within that maze. Is actually a maze. Is a web of belief. As Oman van Quine says, that knowledge acquisition is actually a web of beliefs. And you go to kind of churn it to get what you want. So that's exactly what also Hegel is doing in the Phenomenology of Spirit. Like, for example, he covers a section in the beginning, how time and being. And Martin Heidegger also deals with time and being and time. Because we are all an essence of being and time. As time passes, survival and existence also passes. And there is the concept of now. Now. That's the first spot where Hegel starts now. But if you stay a few minutes, the now that you're talking about is gone. So you are talking of then. And if you have walked away from the position you're talking not of here, you're talking of there. So that dialectics that Hegel deals with, I kind of dealt with in the first section of the program. You can go back. They're still there on YouTube. You can conceptualize what I'm saying, but here I'm just trying to kind of put things into perspective. So you see that aspect of just being on time, he puts it beautifully, but he doesn't call it being on time like Martin Heidegger. He just says that's the acquisition of consciousness. And acquisition of consciousness, according to Hegel, starts at universal law. Everything starts at a tabula rasa of universal law. And knowledge develops from there. And most of human beings and most of the things in the universe, they have got to obey universal law. And if you remember in the programs that I did earlier, you remember I dealt with subject like gravitation. Gravitation is a law that most of the things in the world have got to obey. Let's say, for example, you throw a stone in the air, it got to come down. The gravitational pull is going to pull it down to Earth. That's a universal law. Then there is the aspect like of being born. Human beings reproduce. Animals do the same thing. It's a universal law. You eat to survive. It's kind of a universal given that you'll go look for food no matter what. You either hunt or you plant something to eat. Now, as Hegel continues, you remember the second program, you can see the text on the board there or here. He deals with how human beings start to define the things they see around them. And he picks something like salt. Human beings, as they look at salt, which is material available in the environment, is a very, very good example of how knowledge is acquired. Because he looks at salt and uses it for the acquisition of knowledge. How does he do it? If you look at salt, it's white in color. When they process it, salt is white. And as it continues, the whiteness is a characteristic of salt. And salt, if you taste it, is tart. To the tongue, is tart. And is in cubicles. So you can see it's salt itself. He even uses it as if salt has a consciousness. Because you see, Hegel looks at everything as if they are talking to the self. Salt has a certain consciousness. The self-consciousness of salt is tart. And its looks and its taste is separable from sugar. So as salt looks at itself and its qualities and characteristics that I have said is white, is tart, and is cubical in shape, that is aspect that Hegel covers in his piece of phenomenology of spirit or mind. Essential nature here is universal, not genuine, for it is conditioned by sense. So not entirely universal, so it lacks the genuine self-identical universality. And it has free constituents. Then Hegel now, as he continues, he introduces that in the environment, there is the aspect of force. Because you see, salt, to be in the nature that it is, and to have the characteristics that I am talking about in the program, is that salt has to be together. The entities have to have a force that puts it together. Chloride is a combination of elements that have come together to form salt. And the combination in chemistry, in most cases, there has to be a force of salt in the chemistry for things to combine. And also that is also a universal law, that in chemical reactions, there are some formulas that will have to happen for them to make material that is required from those combinations. And that's very interesting because you see, he's going into so much detail that just the force itself, it starts to play in the self-consciousness of salt. Because as the entities of salt combine, it's as if they're talking to one another. There's negative, positive elements, and there is contradiction, and there is dialectics. The dialectics of formation of salt into its separate parts and then coming together, and the sense certainty of its taste and how it looks and the shape it takes, cubical. All those are contradictions by Hegel's standards. Just the way salt is put together to be salt for human beings to use. And then salt, looking at itself in Hegel's kind of thinking, it is, if it looks at sugar, there is rivalry between it and sugar. Because for salt to be there, sugar has to be there. So there is, again, another dialectics that you're dealing with. That for there to be salt that tastes tart, there has to be sugar that tastes sweet. Kingdom of laws. Just I'll read from the notes that I have. To comprehend the work of force and understanding, one has to decipher the role of unconditioned universal, salt in its natural state. Somebody had to understand its utility when it came to taste of food. Mind and understanding using perception, the salt's characteristics became clear. Phenomena and noumena at play in these states. The entities of salt at universal stage holding to qualify the scrutiny of understanding. So that one you can go into details because you see, Hegel is very, 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 very deep in that salt, in self-consciousness, he uses it also to express the dialectics that you find in man himself. Because you see, to Hegel, an individual is a whole parcel of contradictions, negative and positivity, dialectics, thesis, antithesis, and hypothesis. All these things are at work in a human being. Because you see, human being by nature, he wants everything for himself. And himself, as he defines himself, and he realizes he can think and he has a mind, he's not like an animal walking in a bush. Man starts to be hedonistic, love for self, and love to have everything. That's the nature of the individual. If not checked by laws, which some are made by individuals like him so that he can be checked, man always gets out of control. And the whole of Hegel's writing, Phenomenology of Spirit, actually is the contradiction and conflicts in an individual. Because even Hegel in his discussion, when he says man for checking the self, that he doesn't become so selfish to become self-destructive, he has to check himself vis-a-vis others and put control of his needs. And how does he do that? He starts to realize also for himself to survive and have a nice life and be appreciated and loved, he has to accommodate others. So actually in a Greek philosophy of antiquity, the Greeks have it that a wise man said, for a person to be considered wise and virtuous, he has to actually obey the laws and customs of his nation. That's the wise and virtuous man. Because once you start to respect the laws and customs of your environment and system, then you start to learn to live with others. You have got to sacrifice for the bigger good in life. And that is actually a very deep essence in Hegel's writing. In that man, using reason and searching for truth and objective reality. Here, just consider, this is Hegel, this is not Richard Rorty. I am talking about Hegel. Because Richard Rorty in 1979 negated all those things that Hegel considered important. But Hegel believed in objective reality. He was an idealist. So, individual's life by Hegel's standards, you'll find in the whole piece from the beginning is just this war using different arsenals, using different kind of fights, disagreements, abstract, physical, verbal, all kind of dialectical things are happening in Hegel's writing inside and outside the individual. As he acquires knowledge, he acquires it because of the questioning, answering, asking him questions. All these conflicts, determined, undetermined situations are always appearing in individual's life in Hegel's piece. And as you remember in Immanuel Kant, the critique of pure reason, which also Hegel respects a lot and actually borrows it for him to discuss the phenomenology of spirit and the acquisition of knowledge, he actually takes Immanuel Kant's material and he actually uses it to show how an individual acquires self-consciousness. Because a perception, notion, concept, reason, understanding, perception, ideas, all these are interwoven in Hegel's discussion of phenomenology of spirit. There is nothing he leaves out. He cannot arrive at acquisition of knowledge if he doesn't actually put together what Immanuel Kant provided him in the pure, the critique of pure reason. So you can see like this piece I'm having here, and this piece now here you can see conceptual consciousness. Perception plus perception equal concept plus concept equal notion, opinion, discussion, using thought plus understanding and experience. Because that way, the child we talked about in the beginning when we're talking about being on time is acquiring knowledge. And a perception is a very key thing in a child acquiring knowledge. Perception, how he perceives his environment, how he perceives his mind, how he perceives ideas as they go. They're churned in the mind for him to understand the external and the internal of the self. And as an individual acquires knowledge from those facts, acquisition of those facts, he starts to separate himself from the object. He's not an object. He's a thinking thing. He's a thinking entity. And that is so important because Descartes also goes there, and he arrives. We are what we are because we think. All these things are developing during enlightenment. Man is asking, who am I? Who am I? Because he wants to understand himself. And self-consciousness force comes to play. You cannot have negative, positive things happening if you don't have force. Force is a universal law. And the universal law right at the top is where man starts. But a man starts to divide himself from other creatures. Because if a man looks at a wild animal, he can see clearly they are different. So this discussion is man trying to see himself and where he fits in life. This is what Hegel is doing. He is trying to see man and life. Just the way Martin Heidegger did. That the most important thing for human beings is existence. They want to exist. That is Martin Heidegger. He is telling us that man is striving to exist. But you can see the difference between him and Hegel. Hegel is saying the purpose of man on earth is acquisition of knowledge, to understand the self. And he's very much like, what is this French, the French philosopher Foucault. Foucault also deals with the self. Now, let us just look at this piece which is before us. True world equal world of appearance. Most of the formulas that can be used to define motion with these variables in play, time, space, speed, velocity, mass, energy, positive, negative, and many more, always in states of differences, but yet able to work together to solve a human problem. All these things, they have differences. And these differences have their positivity and negativity. And when not utilized properly by man so that he forms a formula and brings a negative and positive together to produce electricity, these things are just out there living as differences. But for them to work and produce the miracles they do, even in nanotechnology, it is the utilization of the differences in them, the negative positivity. When they balance, they produce a positive thing. Electricity, Edison, lightning. He looked at lightning forming and then he said, oh, what is that? During the rainy season, Edison saw lightning and then it produced light where he was. Then he said, how can I produce that? Then he hit two metals together. Then there was, energy. Then he thought, how can I harness? How can I hold that and help man with that energy? Then he discovered the bulb. So you see, in all these things that Hegel was discussing, he arrives now at the concept, the acquisition of knowledge. You acquire knowledge and you use language to a certain level. Language has got also to be used with logic. They have got to fuse together. And then you start to have formulas. Because mathematics and science is a Golgi Frege, not Frege, Frege, Gottlieb Frege, the German philosopher. He is the one now you can use as, at this point, Hegel reaches and explains the consciousness of man using senses: taste, hearing, seeing, touch, and language. Takes him up to a certain level. Then there comes a time he has to introduce analytic philosophy, and synthetic philosophy starts to come together. And that is Oman van Quine in the Two Dogmas. He explains exactly where the language and definitions reach a point where they cannot solve man's problems. Now formulas set in, set and context. Now you start having, energy equal mc squared. Now you start having formulas coming into play to help man to acquire knowledge. And this is all happening as Hegel is writing his piece. Gottlieb Frege, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Carnap, Ayer, the Vienna Circle, they're all out there. But don't forget, as we discussed the Western philosophers, also in the Chinese section, knowledge is being acquired. In Japan, knowledge is being acquired. In Egypt, knowledge is acquired. In West Africa, knowledge is being acquired. Knowledge, as I said earlier, the tool you need to have knowledge is only one thing. You got to have a language. When you have language, there is no limit to your acquisition of knowledge. And it doesn't have to be English. It doesn't have to be German. This came in when people colonized others and played down on other people's languages and knowledge. So this thing I'm discussing in the concept of Hegel, they are found in all human beings. He was discussing a human being in general. That's a subject for another time, because once we bring politics into these things, then you start to have others. And I discussed about Hegel and others, because Hegel is the one who shows you that man is selfish, whether you like it or not. Man is no angel. You would want a man to be an angel, but that's far from it. He cannot be an angel. He wants everything for himself. Like, look at the United States or the world in general now. 2% of the population owns the whole wealth of the world. 4%, 5% of the people, billionaires, they own all the wealth of the world. 4%. 4% of the people. And they are not embarrassed or feeling bad. They say, okay, come here, people. I'm going to divide my wealth to my friends and to my neighbors. No. So you can see how Hegel discusses man in the Western concept is exactly how man is. He is always trying to see ways of where he can have everything for himself. Possession of things. Now, let me just go into deeper concepts because if we go into bringing examples of the now life, the individual and wealth, we're going to lose the track of our subject discussing the details of phenomenology of spirit. Because the inner world of appearances, the inner world that we don't see, because there is an inner world of we don't see, the nano, the deep down world that we don't see, the world of appearance, is where things are, and that's where knowledge is. And that is where deeper acquisition of knowledge helps us to get to, so that we can decipher, like the digital world came to us as a result of going deeper into smaller, into the Occam's razor. The simpler the things are, the better. Or Schumacher, small is beautiful. So this chapter of inner world, empty, nothingness of appearance, naked universe, things which cannot be known, infinity or infinite, absolute universal. Not much of this inner world is known, remains void and realm, a void realm. Areas said to be beyond consciousness in a room. It's like, for example, this is a very, very good example. Let's say a blind man is taken into a room and there is gold everywhere, and he is put in there because he can't see. Forgive me for using that example. Sight is important for you to be able to see, and you know that's gold and he has value. So in a dark room, if you don't know things are there, that's the inner world. You have to visualize, and the sciences open up the inner world of appearances. So that's an example of like knowledge. To individuals, the inner world sense certainty of consciousness is also referred as the super sensible world, the world of appearances, where dialectics or contradictions of positive negative situations are in constant cancellation of one another. This behavior leaves the law of force dominant in the inner world. This is where the transcendental is good to conceptualize it that way. Law of force, inner universal, time, space, speed, velocity, mass, energy, positive, negative, and many other more, always in states of differences. I kind of went through that. So the sciences have to come in and help us. So if you read like Oman van Quine, object was an object, you will see that he goes into language, goes up to informants. You remember when he sees a Gavagaya is a rabbit in that language of the people, the indigenous people. Then he uses language to kind of interpret what this informant means. Then he reaches a point, infinitum, knowledge infinitum. You have got to bring in the empirical and the sciences to fill the gap. X and Y, variables. The variables. For things to have value, variables have to be there. The pronouns of truth. And this is the world that is being discussed at this point. And you familiarize yourself with it. Now, at this point now, Hegel, because I discuss about others, in this chapter of self-consciousness, free and bondage, self-consciousness it takes the format of a human person. And the consciousness are in conflict, self-consciousness. Because the selfishness of man, there is always the idea that he wants to enslave the other brother of his. Man is always wanting to take everything. So the idea of free and slave, bondage, serf, lord, is a human behavior. It is in his consciousness. Because dialectically, the negative and positive aspects of self are always at a fight, a conflict inside the one, oh, am I doing right thing? I'm doing a wrong thing. Is this thing right or bad? Should I take this thing which is not mine and leave it for the owner? Or should I take a little, or should I take everything? Those questions which constantly are in your mind, am I better than this person? Is this person better than me? There is that inner conflict. But at the same time, in the institutions of the day, where power comes from ownership, the self is always struggling to take as much as possible so that he can be wealthy, and wealth brings power, whether you like it or not. That's the way the Western concept looks at power. Power is made from wealth, the dominating of other people, other individuals. So the conflict that you see in phenomenology of spirit in this section is actually what is so important. Because Hegel, in the whole of phenomenology of spirit, he is showing how man is always striving to dominate. And the self-consciousness at one time tells itself, I am not an object, I am a person, and I think. And he says, I'm going to sacrifice myself, even my life, to acquire the freedom that I want. And the one who goes to the extreme of saying, I can never be dominated by any other person. I'm going to be a free person, always, becomes the master. The self-consciousness that has that thought becomes the master. The one which wavers and becomes as if and starts to think that it can enjoy itself. It lives by the desires of its body and it enjoys the luxuries of the world and sacrifices its freedom for its happiness on earth, is actually enslaved by the one who sacrifices and can kill even for freedom. He enslaves the one who can't go to that level of freeing oneself. So the self-consciousness itself is in struggle of freedom. And Hegel uses self-consciousness to explain only those who sacrifice their lives can give their lives for their freedom, becomes masters. And what it kind of shows is that the colonized people, the indigenous people, forgive me to say this, because Hegel looks at it as if they wanted to be colonized. Their self, the self-consciousness of the others, is submissive to oppression. Can you imagine? Hegel looks at colonized people as a people who are weak, as a people who don't sacrifice. They're not so stoic. They're skeptics. The masters are the stoics. They can sacrifice themselves and bear pain for better gain in the future. So actually, literally, Hegel justifies, almost justifies, I don't mean he writes it down, but it's subtly the idea, the kind of mind he has when he writes this thing. He's looking at the colonizer, who are the Western countries, the Germans in Tanzania and Namibia, the British in Kenya and Tanzania, and even the Germans in Tanzania before the British, the French in West Africa. So he's writing looking at the Westerners as the dominant factor in Africa and the world. They have colonized America, the Newfoundlands. They have dominated Hawaii. They have gone to Australia and oppressed the Aborigines. So this writing is justifying almost that the consciousness of the colonized is submissive. Literally, if you read it, it shows you the consciousness that people have in the colonies is aggressive dependency, as Professor Ali Mazrui calls it. But deep in themselves, they have sacrificed their freedom for being helped to survive in the environment by the master. That simply is actually my interpretation of that piece. You can read it and you can kind of arrive at different interpretation. Now, there is also this piece of kind of covered it, in the piece I gave about a bondsman, double consciousness. Because it ends up that actually the self-consciousness of the bondsman is as if he has given himself to serve the master. And no matter how much he tries to think he can be free, he will always be the one providing the labor for the master. He works for the master. And the master makes everything and gives him just a small portion. So he remains dependent to the master. And those are the words of Hegel. As much as he fights to be free and supply himself and his family for the self, he always finds for his survival, he has to depend on the master. And that's self-consciousness being used abstractly to kind of justify ownership of the master and the situation of the colonized people. So what I said, in philosophy of the day, the philosophers of the day have actually constructed the foundation of oppression. It starts from self-consciousness. The formation of self-consciousness. And they evolve words. The words are evolved so that, words are very, very important. Although facts and everything, but words, the predicates, how you put together sentences. There has to be literature which supports oppression. Now, most of the Western philosophy supports oppression of others. Because the individual in the Western concept, he's the apex of life. His will, the kingdom of wills. He wants everything for himself. And that is his will. The kingdom of will is that the means justifies the end. So once he has acquired so much that most of the food is thrown away instead of given to the poor, he sits back and says, how can I help these poor people around me? He's not looking for equity. He's saying, I will always be the one to have everything, and then I will decide how much I can give those others. It's kind of a determined situation. That's how serious it is. Accidental saga of oppressing others. From sense and thought pure consciousness. Bondsman, through fortuitous ebroglio, accidental scandal, gives in to a duality that burdens it with the carrying of master's problems and its own problem of juggling the world of positivity and negativity in its consciousness. Look at that. That's how the world is. The bondsman carries the master's problems, and he can't explain why. It becomes a giddy wheel of perpetuality, self-creating disorder. As Hegel has it, it produces this self-impelling confusion. Vertigo's effect. You are in this situation, but you can never explain how to get out of it. Empirical consciousness, as Gottlieb Frege calls it, a state of fixed order of predicate calculus. This situation lacks essential being. The negativity of all singleness and all differences for bondsman to come out of this quagmire is impossible. This becomes an infinite way of life for the bondsman. This becomes like a permanent whirlpool of gravity on a larger scale that keeps the cosmos in perfect harmony of movement. There is a word there, I can typo even in the other program, you remember. So I'm just reading this, but I have explained it. An essential position bondsman consciousness finds itself. It is full at times of being free of the confusion it had willingly caused, but soon it realizes this is a mirage, for it still feels the confusion. So you can see here consciousness. of a master and the consciousness of a bondsman. Hegel brings it clearly. And he brings it in front of the people to read. As you read his text slowly, you will see the justification that there has to be a master and there has to be a bondsman. Because for you to enslave the other human being, there has to be a philosophy behind it. And it is really subtle. For those who will read and get it to know, oppression is actually in the Western philosophy, word per word. That for you to be a master, this is the way you have to behave. You can only achieve mastership if you follow this route. Self-same consciousness to confused. This is now the bondsman. Confused and confusing consciousness. It lacks the ability to synchronize the two states of consciousness. It at times feels free, a state being in a lifted state from the beginning, but this deremption doesn't in reality exist. It is just an illusion. You're always feeling as if you're free, but it's an illusion. This one I'm going to read just is the real text. This is verbatim. What is set forth here as a mode and relation of the unchangeable came to light as the experience through which self-consciousness passes in its unhappy state of deremption. This experience is now doubtless not its own one-sided process, for it is itself unchangeable consciousness, and this latter consequently is a particular consciousness as well. And the process is as much a process of that unchangeable consciousness, which makes its appearance there as subtly as the other. For that movement is carried on in these moments, and unchangeable now opposed to the particular in general, then being itself particular, opposed to the other particular, and finally at one with it. But this consideration, so far as it is our affair, is here out of place. For thus far we have only had to do with unchangeableness as unchangeableness of consciousness, which for that reason is not true immutability, but is still affected with an opposite. We have not had before us the unchangeable per se and by itself. We do not therefore know how this latter will conduct itself. What has here so far come to light is merely this, that two consciousness, which is our object here. The determinations above indicated appear in the unchangeable. That is philosophy proper. You got to read it, digest it, and understand what it's saying. Now, program 6, because I told you I'm putting everything together. You can go and listen to the other one, come to this one, and then see the whole piece together. It feels confusing, but if you go slowly and try to comprehend it, you will see it's understandable. It's the contradiction in the life of an individual. an individual is nothing but a compilation of contradictions, dialectical things. Reason, according to Hegel in his book entitled Phenomenology of Spirit, helps to bring out the reality in self-consciousness. This is possible through ideas. Now you see, as knowledge is acquired by the individual, there are terms introduced in the Western philosophy. They are like wand, magic wands. You do like this, the man disappears. Reason is one of those words that the Greeks bestowed onto the Western philosophy. Now, if you're using reason, you'll always go for facts. And if you go for facts, you will always be seeking for truth. That's the logic. Now, that's why the word reason comes in the Western philosophy. Because to justify things like what human beings do, there has to be these magical words. That guy is not reasonable. Why? That's why he's acting like that. Conscientious, concise, agreeing, discussing things which will be helpful to man, and then getting the facts together, how you're going to build a dam, how you do the irrigation. You all agree for us to grow more food. We have got to harness the power of water. And how are we going to do it? We have a river. We have got to dig ditches. They got to be slopey so that the water can flow. There has to be concise inner voice of saying that is the right thing to do. It doesn't have to be reasoned. Reason doesn't have to be there. If something is going to help the human life, is going to contribute to the well-being of man, then that's the right thing to do. You can say, okay, you're using reason. You can say you're trying to get to the truth. But the fact is, man is always trying to better himself. And as long as they're living as a community, those ideas that will be put together and will result into positive development and bettering of human life, increasing happiness, joy, health, power, might be to the people. That is a positive thing to do. So actually, language helps us to achieve concise. That point where we reach and we see things with one mind. We say that's the right thing. But here, reason is introduced. As human beings acquire knowledge, they introduce reason. And that is a very interesting thing, because it is very, very important for you to understand reason in the Western concept is a wand. Objective reality. You ask yourself, you didn't have objective reality, but people did their things. They developed good ways of transportation, educational system. They developed good agriculture, self-sufficient in food. There was harmony, law, and order in the country. But they didn't have things like, oh, it's because we reason. Can you have a world where they don't say, we are like this because we reason? They don't have the word reason, but they are so developed. They don't search for truth. They're always searching for things to better human life. That is actually Rotian, Richard Rorty. And that is not Hegelian. Hegelian is that it's actually putting the Greek philosophy into perspective. The Western philosophy in Hegel is that actually all these things you're seeing Hegel writing about, the soul of Hegel's thinking, that's why he calls phenomenology of spirit. In every word, even in reason itself, at the center of reason is spirit. There's a living spirit in the word reason, and is the one which drives. Hegel has the word reason with a spirit building it. And the entity of reason is spirit. And spirit is the living soul of everything. So what Hegel is doing is that everything which produces good thing, at the center of it is the spirit. So actually, in a real sense, if you start to look at that perspective, apart from that it introduces the justification of bondsman and master, and the selfishness of individuals, and glorification of that mentality in the Western concept, the really core factor, the essence of philosophy of Hegel, is that as he discusses all this acquisition of knowledge, right at the top, the apex of such is spirituality. So at the same time, that's why you see Hegel is a very, very controversial figure, in the sense that if you look at that logic, that at the center of the phenomenology of mind is actually spirit, is driving everything, then it's a very interesting concept. I've just got to leave that to you, because I don't want to be religious or spiritual, but that's a fact. It is important at this juncture to say that the individual I is at this point acquiring knowledge, because he has already started to reason. He's thinking, he's understanding, he's observing, he has cognition, he's starting to kind of become educated. He's acquiring knowledge through understanding, perception, experience, observation, allowing the I to use reason to get at truth. But man by nature, you can see there, he's developing quite all kind of things. Then Linus is the guy who came up with in the 18th century the classification of species, giving birds, and some like penguin, walrus, they live in cold climates. Lion, elephants, and all this in hot climate in the savannah. And these trees are found in these areas. You go to Europe, you find these trees. Linus came with that classification. Also, Hegel deals with he deciphers the aspect of a genus, species, in the way animals are divided up. He also comes up with that concept. And he does it in detail. And human beings' observation and experience are the fountain of truth for self-consciousness. That's an important point for you to kind of note, because now in science, because you see Gottlieb Frege has introduced the fixed order of predicate calculus, the way of solving abstract things using mathematical formulas. Now, there is one thing. For you to be able to do that ably and get things right, not perfect, because as Russell, Frege, Wittgenstein, Carnap, they already have arrived that the knowledge is never complete. Knowledge is it doesn't mean if you're using science you're always 100% getting things right. There is something which is not right at every formula you're using, and that's why you keep on adding small things to perfect it. You get a PhD because you have added something small in the advancement of knowledge. So you can see it is never complete. It will never give you a complete answer. There will always be something lacking, and you will hear somebody has gotten a Nobel Prize because he has added a small section which has helped us to come up with a better COVID-19 vaccine, which can actually eradicate all types of variants. That's a very good example to give. So there is never a complete solution. As I continue, I will remember this book which was written in I'm going to remember it, and I'm going to throw it in and I'm going to tell you that's what I was thinking about. Because that is exactly what observation is telling us. Perfection is never there. So you can see analytic sentences tell us about logic and about language use. They don't give us meaningful information about the world. Sorry for that typo. Synthetic statements, on the other hand, are based on our sensory data and experience. The truth value of a synthetic statement cannot be figured out based solely on logic. That's what I was saying. So this is what I'm saying. There is nothing really which finalizes knowledge. So there is organs, inorganic, and you see the differences that you find in things. It is so important. Because you see the differences in things. The differences is like a building block. Now that concept, when I came to understand it, I was very, very pleased. It's like you're building a house and you have bricks, but you don't have cement. In real life, the differences of things, like the difference between protons and electrons, is what will bring them together to form electricity. It is the glue of life. Now, comprehend that, the usefulness of differences. Is so is actually, that is exactly what I'm going to say there. The sciences of differences as things exist in life. You look at life and then you see hydrogen and oxygen. They're different. That differences brings them together, because if negative can attract the positive, then you'll have hydrogen and oxygen come together and they'll give us water. Can you imagine if there was no differences, we would have no water to drink? There would be no life. It is so interesting. But simply that's what they need. The Hegel is, he had a wonderful mind. I don't even think himself sometimes he comprehended what he had done. But in the pieces he has put together, you just go and stumble into this fact within his text and you wow. And then he has Hegel discusses things like bell curve, the bell curve, the book by Murray and Hampstead, the book which says because you're black, you have low IQ. IQ is actually color sensitive. Can you imagine two people, thinkers, they sit together and they write bell curve, and it is based on that IQ equal color of your skin. That's what you call quack science. And Hegel discusses it, physiognomy and phrenology. The shape of your skull will tell what kind of IQ you have. Your facial expressions will tell either you're a murderer or, these quack sciences, which they have been there even before Markov. Hegel deals with them. And he kind of looks at it and tells you, please don't be a palmist and start telling people you can tell the IQ of somebody from reading his palm. Get some money from it, but don't misuse science like that. So, I have a small chapter here that a good example here is the book Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure by Charles Murray and Richard Heinstein, written in 1990. It was very controversial. And poverty was biological, based on the color of your skin. This kind of literature is what is dividing the world. That one is not in Hegel, but he kind of brings up that that's a very strong belief of self-consciousness. Because I told you, man wants to look unique. And he wants to separate himself as if he is the king of knowledge, the king of cool. And that one he will only do by putting the others down. But in life, one thing you should avoid so much is doing that. It doesn't help, but people are always into it. Now, I will leave these things there, and just you look at it. It is something I have kind of gone through it into so much details. I'm going to put it actually in one piece and you can read it. So until we meet again, this is your friend, Dr. Gilbert Githere, coming to your home just to look at Hegel and the things he gave us. And if you read it slowly, decipher it, you will see that Hegel was concerned about the individual. And actually, as the self-consciousness deciphers itself, now you'll excuse me, I'll stop there. Until we meet again, this is your host, Gilbert Gicharu Githere, saying ciao, ciao.